Welcome to this episode of the Tech F1 show where I'm looking back at Suzuka. So sorry I'm a bit late to recording this episode of the Tech F1 show. It's just purely because I've been off on holiday over the last few days and I've not been concentrating heavily on the F1 side of things, just trying to kick back and relax a little. So firstly, let's have a look at Red Bull Racing. Obviously we always start with Red Bull because they're at the top of the constructors rankings, and they're the team that most people associate with wanting to know about it within the sport because they're the team that are dominating at the moment. Here we've got Sebastian Vettel's RB9 from the Suzuka Grand Prix, and following that we have Mark Webber's RB9. Now the reason that I'm showing both of those cars is that there are some differences between the two setups that the two drivers used at Suzuka. Mainly or predominantly to do with the rear wing design, which I'll go over in more detail in a moment, but also that we have the flap angles at the front were adjusted to sort out the aero balance between the front and the rear of the car. So if we move onwards to the rear wing design, as I say, we've got two different designs at play here, and the design at the top here is Sebastian's rear wing, and the design at the bottom here is Mark Webber's rear wing. Now, without knowing what you're looking for, it might be a little difficult to notice the differences, but they are completely different rear wings. There is not a component on there that is identical to one another. So the rear wing that Mark used isn't specific for Suzuka, whereas the wing that Sebastian used was. Now I think the reason that we saw Mark use this particular rear wing, which is a skinnier rear wing, is because he felt that he wanted to take advantage in qualifying over Sebastian and maybe jump him on the grid kind of thing. The differences between the two rear wings, right? Okay, well we've got the rear wing end plates here, are totally different in design. As you can see, the top element of the one on Mark Webber's is curved away and only has the three end plate louvers, which reduce the outer tip drag. And the ones on Sebastian's is a straighter end plate, but has four louvers in the end. So obviously you're counterbalancing drag versus downforce between the pair of those two rear wings. The main plane is angled much shallower on Mark's rear wing. As you can see, there's a higher angle of attack on Sebastian's wing. Although obviously we do have the more centralised portion of the wing here with the upturn in there to allow the airflow underneath the wing. The DRS pods, the actuators, are sized differently according to the angle of attack. So the skinnier rear wing has got a much shallower, smaller actuator pod, and the top flap itself is much deeper on Sebastian's, which means that you would also get a bigger DRS advantage should he use that, which obviously in qualifying, that is perhaps where he made up a little bit of time over Mark, as well as obviously the fact that Mark would be a bit disadvantaged through the medium and high downforce areas of the Suzuka circuit with his skinnier rear wing. On the top flap itself, obviously we've talked about the V-groove that the team have run in the past in the centre section of the wing there. On Sebastian, he has a much deeper V-cut into the rear wing, and that obviously reduces drag across the span of the wing. The top flap itself is also designed differently with different camber angles at play between the two different rear wings. So as we can see, there's not really much that we can see that's similar on those two rear wings. They are very different in the way that they're designed, and they both will obviously have different levels of creation of downforce and reduction of drag. As we know, in raw pace there wasn't much of a difference between the two drivers, because in qualifying obviously Sebastian didn't have KERS, so he was 2 and a bit tenths away from the pole position time, but obviously that loss of KERS is probably worth around about 2 3/4, 3 tenths of a second per lap around Suzuka. So the two are very close in terms of the way that they will have operated around that circuit. Something else that Red Bull and many of the other teams, but predominantly Red Bull, have been playing around with over the last few races has been the rear brake ducts. It's an area that the teams will work on track characteristic wise, and the reason for that is that obviously you require different levels of downforce and drag reduction based upon the particular characteristic of circuit that you're visiting. So in the inset here we can see that the team are running flow vis on the brake duct and on the diffuser, and the reason they're doing that is because those two flow regimes flow into one another and help to extract downforce. The inset at the top here that I've marked out is from a previous race from Korea, and you can see that on this particular brake duct here you've got a continuation of the outer section of the drum, the brake duct, sorry, whereas on the Korea version there's perforations in the edges of that, and it's just the way that the air flows into that region and the way that it controls how the airflow passes outwards from the brake duct. Moving on to McLaren. Now McLaren actually ran a new front wing nose configuration at Korea, but it was only on Jenson Button's car. Another perhaps idea that the team are moving towards for 2014 and putting the groundwork in place to test what they're looking to do for next season. But if we take a look at the old configuration front wing, we can see obviously what the team have been running for quite some time, which is the tri-delta front wing, and the pylons are much closer to the front edge of the main plane. However, if we look at the new front wing that the team ran at obviously Korea on Jenson's car and for both drivers in Suzuka, we can see that the team have actually moved the front nose pylons onto the rear edge of the main plane rather than in the central section just here. It was much further forward in the old design. Tied to that as well, they've also made changes around the way that the main plane attaches to the secondary flap. So now that it's a much more driven design to allow for vortices to be driven off the inside edge of the wingspan, as well as obviously helping to control the airflow that enters underneath the first section of the wing. What I did find interesting on this particular design of wing, we'll talk about in a moment, but firstly we've got to talk about the way that these particular pylons have been put in that position on purpose, and it's something that the other teams have been doing for quite some time. There's two particular reasons why you would want to put those pylons at the rear edge of the main plane rather than in the centre or towards the front of the main plane, and that's all to do with surface area. The pylons can only be a certain distance, they can only measure a certain size, so it's not like the teams can have the pylon go from the front edge of the main plane to the position that we see them on this particular picture. What they have to do is they have to have a certain size, and what McLaren are intending to do by moving the pylons back is help with the way that the airflow moves between the central portions of the nose itself and creates airflow downstream towards the turning vanes, the splitter, etc. But also the way that it helps in managing the airflow that is disturbed when the wheels are in turning positions, and obviously try to push their way in towards the airflow that's heading towards the central section of the car. So it's all about creating a better flow regime to the central portion of the car, and also as an onward effect, something that the teams are still obviously pushing towards but can't really exploit to the levels that there were in the past, is the fact that obviously with the section of the pylons at the back of the main plane, you do have a level of being able to have twist on the main plane and help with movable aerodynamics effectively for when the car's in movement. So this is the old front wing that the team have been running for some time now, as I mentioned, and obviously the way in which that the secondary flap attaches to the main plane here at the joint. This is the section of the front wing which is mandated by the FIA, so every team has the same design. It's very restrictive in how it can be designed, so that the teams have to obviously be inventive beyond that scope. So obviously a fairly crude design in the way that McLaren have simply jutted their sections up against the mandatory section. But in the new design, we can see that they've actually made more of an effort to migrate the joint into a separate section, into the secondary flap. Not only will obviously it help with the way that the airstream moves inbound, it will also help how it works outbound, creating sort of a segregation to the airflow. An interesting part that I noticed when I zoomed in on this particular picture that I showed you before was something that the team have done that I haven't really seen other teams do. It's all to do with the FOM cameras. These cameras are mandated size, they're given to the teams in a particular design format, and they're designed to be aero neutral, but obviously nothing on an F1 car is aero neutral. The teams will always try to use it to their advantage to gain some kind of performance gain over any other team. So what McLaren have done here is they've actually dropped the FOM cameras into a lower position than the pylons themselves. Usually what you will find is that the pylons actually fit right to the base of where the FOM cameras are. That's most predominant on, say, the Lotus E21. They also run the FOM cameras in the central portion just here. And the camera's obviously positions help with the ongoing flow towards the rear of the car. But as I say, what I found interesting is that the cameras are actually dropped below the section whereby the pylons finish at the sides here. Something I'll have a look into in the future. But as I say, it's just something that caught my eye as I was looking through the pictures. Moving on to Ask Summers F1. This is a feature of the newish feature of the show, whereby I ask people on Twitter to throw me any questions that they feel might be advantageous for us to look at for this particular show. It doesn't have to be in regard to the previous race. We can look at other technical things, and to be honest, I'm probably going to run a 2014 Tech F1 show quite soon, looking at what the changes are for the forthcoming season. Because there are so many, it might even have to be split up into separate stages, because talking about it in all in one show might be a bit too much. But obviously we'll do an Ask Summers F1 on that as well. Right, so first question's from Verst, or Haldana, which is, how come that if Red Bull has front wing damage, it seems that their performance drops only slightly? Right, okay, well let's have a look at a front wing of Red Bull from Suzuka, which is the damage that was caused to Sebastian Vettel's front wing end plate when he was involved in the impact with Lewis Hamilton that obviously finished Lewis Hamilton's race. Now bear in mind this is zoomed in, so the resolution isn't perfect, but what we can see is the fact that the foot plate is the part that took the brunt of the damage on Red Bull's front wing here. And what it's done is it's basically sheared the front end of the end plate off, foot plate off. But it's made no damage inbound of that. Although obviously there may be stress, fractures, etc. further inbound. We can't see them from the picture. What we can see is the obvious damage to the foot plate. Now, the structural integrity of that foot plate has pretty much stayed intact. We can see a little ripple effect that's running down the central portion of the foot plate just there. Now that's the difference, I think, between Red Bull and the other teams, is the structural integrity of their wings and the way that they actually design them to withstand impact, for argument's sake, if there were to have any impact when they're having dices with different teams and drivers. But if we have a look at, this is Nico Rosberg's front wing from Suzuka. And he was involved in an incident with Sergio Perez, pretty similar to the way that we saw the incident play out with Lewis Hamilton, in the way that it was to do with that particular type of impact. But as we can see, it's a similar type of damage to the foot plate, similar sort of area, but what we find is that the foot plate itself has actually sheared apart. So we've ended up with a situation where the carbon fibre inside of the inner carbon fibre is exposed to the airflow. So between the two designs, what you end up with is this one is causing more aero disturbance downstream because of the way that the impact has impinged on the design of the foot plate. So we've ended up with a sort of an opening of the foot plate, which will of course change the way in which the vortices are generated downstream. I think, going back to the question, I think it's just their design ethos at Red Bull. I think the way that they test the parts for rigidity, and the way that they understand the fact that dynamically how those parts could be damaged, they will design them based upon those principles. When most people think about carbon fibre, they assume that there is only one type of carbon fibre, and there isn't as many different plies that can be used. So in a front wing you might actually find that there's perhaps 4 or 5 different types of plies involved, and that's all to do with how rigid the actual wing is, where it flexes, what the team wanted to actually achieve at certain speed thresholds can be controlled by the particular type of carbon ply that's being used, and the way that it's either heated or baked, or the resins are applied as it's actually being produced at the back of the factories. It's a complex area that, one of those nuances that people don't really think about. Everybody assumes that the front wing is made of one particular type of carbon fibre, and that's all that you have. Right, so moving back to the second question on this particular section, we've got a tweet from Elise, which is F1 is P1. The pros/cons of push rod versus pull rod suspension would be interesting. Maybe a few topics to come in more than one episode. Well, yeah, it is perhaps an area that could be covered as a totally separate episode, but pull rod versus push rod, it's really driven by, or has been driven over the last few seasons in regards to both tyre dynamics and aerodynamics. The original move by Red Bull and Newey to pull rod rear suspension was aero driven, because he felt that it would offer a better solution to the way in which the airflow can be moved in and around the coke bottle towards the diffuser, giving a more consistent airflow in that particular area. But obviously it also has an ongoing effect in terms of tyre dynamics, because the way that the pull rod and the push rod basically absorb or use the energy as the suspension moves around. Obviously Ferrari and McLaren are now using pull rod at the front of the car, and I think it'll be interesting to see who uses what with the forthcoming rules, with obviously the teams now having to adopt a lower nose tip. But that's something again we'll perhaps talk about with the 2014 version of the show, because I think there might be some teams that will lower the bulkhead and perhaps try to run pull rod suspension rather than the push rod that they've been using in the past. But it's all dependent on, there's one of the biggest factors is the Pirelli tyres and the way that they may affect the racing dynamically for the 2014 season as well. Pirelli will obviously have to make their tyres much more rigid for 2014 to cope with the demands of the extra performance that these low down torque driven engines are going to produce. So it'll be an interesting aspect of the sport. We'll see what teams decide to run pull and push rod. I still think there's not much between the two different designs, and as I say, it's more driven by what type of dynamic you want for the rear wheels, front wheels, in terms of the way that they handle the tyres and degradation, etc., and also how the aero works over the car. Rob Roy, or Minos Dialaides, I've got that really wrong, but There we go. Hey Matt, Hulk Sauber in Korea had great traction that race. Which setup or aero strings can be pulled for that? Well, we looked at that back in the Korea episode of the show, so I'm not going to go over it too much. But effectively, as I mentioned back then, Sauber have really come forward since the change back to the 2012 construction tyres. I think they will be only too pleased to tell you that they were very happy when the 2012 tyres came back. They made errors in the way that they designed their 2013 car based upon the early 2013 construction tyres. And it also coincided with their changeover to the cross-under ramp tunnel like we see on the Red Bull, and I think that they've, over the last few races, they've started to work out how best to utilise that particular setup and how to extract performance from the diffuser. And obviously traction zones are important in terms of downforce as well, so gaining downforce from that particular component is going to be have a massive effect. Cavallino Rampante, another question from you, as we had your question in Korea as well. Could you explain why Red Bull have a lot more KERS issues than any other teams, and how the car reacts when KERS isn't working? So a 2-point question here. Well, KERS issues for Red Bull is really highlighted in the fact that their KERS packaging is different to every other team. Adrian Newey obviously will always be driven more by aerodynamics than he is by everything else. So that in that terms you would say that the car has some compromising areas in terms of packaging. They have their KERS located in the gearbox area rather than under the seat or ahead of the engine like most of the other teams. So the cooling to that particular component is perhaps compromised by its position, and that's moreover perhaps where we see the problems with what Red Bull are doing is the cooling aspect. However, they do run the supercapacitors as well as the normal battery pack, whereas other teams don't do that, so there may be some difference in the way that the actual system handles the power transfer, whether it be under harvesting or use. And in terms of how the car reacts when KERS isn't working, well, obviously it affects the balance of the car. Depends on whether they're still continuing to harvest, which they may do, and that may be the reason why they use the supercapacitors, is to dispense of the energy. But it's all to do with car balance, so it will upset the way in which the driver is able to react with the car and utilise the braking performance of the car. Mr. Pigs, we often hear about aero balance numbers on team radio. How do teams measure and calculate that? I assume you mean when drivers pick up damage, for argument's sake, and the engineers then talk to them about how much downforce they're losing, etc. That's predominantly to do with load sensors that are placed around the car. So obviously the engineers and the drivers will know how much the car actually yields in terms of performance. So each team will talk differently about percentage points, etc., about what they understand as to the load on a particular component of the car. When they lose a particular component from the car, say Nico Rosberg in Suzuka, with his front wing end plate being damaged, foot plate being damaged, he will be losing performance relative from the front of the car to the rear of the car because of the way that the foot plate helps to generate airflow down the side of the car. So that the engineer will tell him effectively how much balance he's losing from that performance area of the car, and then that will help the driver then to be able to make a judgment call, say at a pit stop, to say, well, I want some extra front wing on the car to be able to rebalance the profile of the car. So it's just the engineers and the driver's way of talking to one another to help to understand how they can make changes during pit stops. Obviously there's several things that you can do during a pit stop to help the driver. You can lower or higher the tyre pressures, or you can make adjustments to the front wing angle, and both those options can obviously change the performance of the car overall. Suda, CBE Suda, why did Webber go for the skinny rear wing setup? What role did this play in his inability to overtake Grosjean? Well, as I've already talked at the start of the show, the reason I believe that Webber went for the skinny rear wing is twofold. Firstly, he wanted to make an advantage through qualifying and jump a little further up the grid. He felt that with the skinnier rear wing it gave him an advantage over Sebastian's setup. At the end of the day, those two cars are I would classify as the quickest around Suzuka, raw pace wise. So it was a decision made by Webber and his engineers, etc., to try and help him to get in front of Sebastian. But twofold to that, the other point would be that perhaps the team thought that if Webber did get one of his bad starts or get stuck in traffic, etc., that by having the skinnier rear wing he may be able to effect an overtake quicker, because of being able to get closer to the car in front. The problem with that though was the fact that he was missing the downforce in the corners, and the Lotus had a massive difference in rear wing angle of attack compared to both Red Bulls. In fact, all of the teams ran with barn doors in comparison to Red Bull, so they were affecting a lot more downforce than the Red Bulls throughout the corners. And the trouble with that is wake. So obviously Mark Webber's following Grosjean's dirty air, or his wake, and he's struggling to get close to him in the corners, which means his apex speed is compromised and his exit speed is compromised, which means then that the advantage that he's got onto the straights because of his skinnier rear wing is destroyed by the fact that he can't get close into the corners. So that's perhaps where Vettel, when he got close to Grosjean towards the end of the stints, had the bigger advantage, because throughout the corners he had the chance to be able to get in behind and follow it closer in the dirty wake, just purely because he got that little bit extra downforce. So that's it for the Tech F1 show this week. So it's a little short in terms of content regarding the teams, etc., but as we know, because most of the teams are now concentrating on the 2014 season rather than 2013, parts are coming a little bit slower through for the rest of the season. We won't see so many parts. I'm hoping to see a few more over the next few races and obviously continue with the show, etc. I'll still continue to ask for questions on Twitter for the Asset Summers F1 section, but as we can see, I'd just like to say thanks to Sutton Images as usual for their fantastic contribution, allowing me to use the images both on Twitter, in the blog, and also on the show here, just to illustrate everything that we see at the track. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode of the Indian Grand Prix.